quick introduction here. So we have Marie Moldy. You guys know her. Some of you do. Client Solution Specialist with Data Central. She's been a speaker at some of our events before. Thanks for being with us. And she's going to share some new menu trends using bourbon as an ingredient. And then we have Bo Taylor Beckman, who's with us, and he is the director of Single Barrel Select and works with the Sazerac Group, which has multiple brands and that you all know well, and we've had at our events many, many times. And I love what's on the top of your shelf in the back. That looks really good. So we're going to get started here. And so let's go to Marie first.
Perfect. All right. Thank you, Kevin. So I'll dive right in here. And how I wanted to start is really just a picture of what's happening with bourbon broadly at restaurants today. So I think the first thing here that stands out to me is the really strong trend for bourbon. So here we're looking at not only beverage menus, but also food menus. And bourbon, and I was surprised when I pulled this data, but bourbon is found on over half of restaurant menus across the US. So today, it's on 53% of US menus, and we can see that the trend is really quite strong. Typically, we like to look at this 4-year trend, and bourbon has grown 21% over the past 4 years. And then if we look over here to the right-hand column, the couple stats that I also find interesting, that's that most Americans know bourbon, so they're aware of what it is. 89% of people know it, and over half of us have tried it. That said, a third of people today say they love bourbon, so high enthusiasts, they love it. And when I dove deeper into that data, I found one distinct skew that I think is interesting here. So if we look at the universe of people who love bourbon, does anyone on the phone or the Zoom have an idea whether it's your age or your region of the country or your ethnicity, your income level? Anyone have any thoughts on which of those demographics might show the most distinct skew when it comes to loving bourbon? I don't know if folks on the phone can chime in, but the answer is the gender split. So men are higher enthusiasts for bourbon than are women today. So 67% of men say they love bourbon and 42% of women say the same. So 25% difference there. That said, I'm a woman, I love bourbon, so certainly there are some differences too. I also want to share here that it's not just fine dining menus or casual dining restaurants that have alcohol menus where bourbon is growing today. So here we can see across all segments of the restaurant industry, bourbon has a very strong trend. It's more highly penetrated in these full service restaurants like fine dining that have the alcohol menus. So bourbon is on almost 75% of fine dining menus. But that said, it's also on 6% of QSR menus and 7% of fast casual menus. And again, it's growing in each of those segments. Bourbon is featured in different applications when it comes to the different segments of the industry. And here are a couple examples. So in QSR, it's going to be more commonly found in things like dessert applications or as a burger sauce, for example. So here we see Carvel this summer launched a number of bourbon ice creams, like a vanilla bourbon soft serve or a vanilla coffee shake. And then also bourbon sauces. So Steak and Shake has done a pork belly steak burger with a bourbon sauce. And then if we think about more of that fine dining or casual dining operator, here Carrabba's has done Tuscan grilled lamb chops with, again, a bourbon demi-glace. And what I think is particularly interesting for today's discussion is that, bourbon is definitely not just a beverage. And we've seen that in these menu launches we just covered. But also if we look at menu launches over the past 5 years, bourbon is more commonly featured in food launches than it is in beverage launches. So 58% of introductions are food and 42% are beverage. And just like Chef Ed is going to share with us today, meat entrees are actually the most common type of application for bourbon today, followed by dessert and burgers. So I think our data will help prove that out as we look at more examples across the industry. But I just think it's interesting truly that bourbon is, such a prominent ingredient on food menus today and also growing. So I pulled a couple examples of some of those top applications. So here we're looking at that common application of meat entrees and looking at Cheddar's and Logan's and Eat and Park, various segments of the food service industry. They've all in the most recent year or two launched a meat entree with a bourbon sauce. And most of these are featuring a bourbon glaze. So the shrimp has a homemade bourbon glaze. The double bacon sirloin piece of steak there from Logan's has a blackened brown sugar bacon bourbon glaze. And then we see a fish entree with salmon with a bourbon glaze too. And then burgers, we know that burgers are such a well-loved item from consumers. We see a lot of bourbon introductions on burger menus. I almost feel like a tongue twister saying these. We have the bourbon bacon burger, the bacon boss burger, and the bourbon barbecue brisket burger. And interestingly, bourbon is described differently. The level of detail does differ with these launches. So with Arby's, for example, they called out that this was a barrel-aged Kentucky bourbon barbecue sauce, whereas this Denny's launch doesn't give quite as much detail. There they just say bourbon sauce. So it is described with a bit more detail depending on the operator. And then lastly, and I'm also a registered dietitian, and as a hobby, I follow a lot of food blogs. And I think it's interesting that bourbon also lends itself to healthy items. It's not what we're looking at here. We're looking at bourbon and dessert launches, but I noticed in talking with Kevin about this presentation, I think bourbon was on my mind, and I saw bourbon in like a instant pot, chicken dish from a healthy living blogger. So it really spans the spectrum, and it can be a healthy flavoring or ingredient, but it can also be a really delicious dessert application. So here we have a whiskey bundt cake and a bourbon fudge pie. And then technically this Denny's launch is a breakfast, but I think pancakes could arguably be a dessert. And here they have a really delicious caramel apple walnut bourbon sauce. So that takes me to the end of my slides here. And I think with those, I really wanted to paint the picture of bourbon as certainly a trending ingredient and also a very versatile item that happens on all menu categories today.
It's good. I came here to get drunk, bet on horses, maybe meet a girl and have a good weekend. I didn't think that was going to turn into 10 years. I'm not from the South, and I never really pretend to cook Southern food. But I think as a chef, you can't live in a place and not be influenced by your surroundings. To me, tradition is something that's alive. Tradition is something that changes constantly. Tradition is something that's living.
Hello, everybody. How are you? So I'm so sad that we can't all be together in Louisville, because I know we were supposed to be in my restaurant and we're supposed to be eating and drinking together. So this is the next best thing. But I'm doing a pork recipe today with bourbon, and we're going to do bourbon two ways. We're going to put it in the marinade, and we're also going to make a sauce out of it. And I think one of the most important things about bourbon, and now as I'm cooking, I'm going to go through some tips, but I'm going to start with this real quick. This is just bourbon in a pan. And as I'm reducing this, I'll talk a little bit about sort of my theories of cooking with bourbon, because I cook with bourbon a lot, and I think it's really important to know how to cook with bourbon when you're starting to use it as an ingredient. First of all, obviously, bourbon is an alcohol. So there are many things where actually consuming or eating the alcohol doesn't taste very good. So in most of the applications where I use bourbon, I actually reduce it down. And I will create a bourbon flavored liquid that is free of alcohol, or at least free of most alcohol. And basically all you have to do with that is reduce it. I usually reduce it by a third. That will evaporate the alcohol. It will concentrate the flavor of your bourbon. And it will create a nice versatile sort of a bourbon concoction. It does make it more expensive because whatever you purchase, you're only getting a third out of it. But I think it's important to concentrate the flavor because it only intensifies what you're using it for. And as you can see, it doesn't take long. Like at my restaurant, we'll take entire like jugs of bourbon and reduce it down and just have that already pre-made, like it's just like you grab a bottle of soy sauce and use it. We'll just grab a bottle of pre-reduced bourbon so that we don't have to worry. Like if I want to add it to a vinaigrette or even a flavoring or something on a dessert, I don't have to worry about the alcohol being there. Obviously, there are also many customers who choose not to consume alcohol. So for them, when you say a bourbon chocolate pot de creme, we usually get the question first, like, is there alcohol in here? And what we can tell them is no, the alcohol is burned up. You don't have to worry about it. So those are a few of the considerations of using bourbon. As you can see, it reduces down, and I'm eyeballing everything today. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to start with my marinade. I'm doing pork chops. So I've got some nice, yummy pork chops in here. And what I want to do is take this flavor and put it into that pork chop. And I'm just going to add a few other things to help it along. So real quick, I'm going to chop up a little bit of garlic. Just a rough chop, since we're not going to actually use the garlic. It's just for the flavoring. Put it in my pork marinade bag. I've got some soy sauce. About 2 tablespoons of soy sauce will go in here. That's my dog. He doesn't like soy sauce, apparently. I got Worcester, about a tablespoon of Worcester. And then I'm going to do about 1 tablespoon of brown sugar. So here's what I'm doing with this marinade. I don't want to add too many ingredients. I don't want to add spices. I don't want to complicate it because I really want the bourbon to drive the marinade. So really the soy sauce and Worcester kind of work together. Both are fermented. And if you think about it, so is bourbon, right? Like when we start thinking about it as an ingredient for food, I see a lot of similarities between soy sauce, Worcester, bourbon. They're all fermented products. They all have umami. They all have a deep, rich flavor. So I'm really just kind of fortifying each other with the bourbon. The garlic obviously is going to help give it that unique garlic flavor to it. And the brown sugar, which again, most bourbons will have notes of, brown sugar or caramel or butterscotch. And again, those things just lend a hand. They kind of enhance what's already in the bourbon. Now, what you're not going to get from bourbon or Worcester or brown sugar is this sense of the smokiness, the age, the sort of the leathery notes. Those are very unique to bourbon. As if you guys are all aware, I'm sure bourbon is 51% corn liquor, so you're going to get sweetness dropping from that. Then it's aged a minimum of 4 years in a charred oak barrel. So what you're getting is that burnt char flavor that's like sort of slowly seeping into. And so this color, this brown color, is actually coming from the charred wood. When the corn liquor goes into the barrel, it's clear. After 4 or 5 years, it starts picking up color. So here's where I have my rule of thumb. Because you can use bourbon anywhere from a dessert application to a vinaigrette to like a savory application, which is what I'm doing here. And my rule of thumb is this: the younger the bourbon. So everyone always asks me, what bourbon do you use? Like what brand of bourbon do you use? And to me, it doesn't matter the brand of bourbon. What matters more is the age statement. So the younger the bourbon, it will have sat in the barrel less. Now you have to, in order to be a bourbon, you have to have a minimum of 4 years. So that's going to be the youngest bourbon that you can possibly use. 4 years in a barrel, it will not have picked up as many of the charred notes. It will not have picked up a lot of the smokiness, the leather. It will be a little bit, sometimes we say in the industry, it'll be taste a little green or a little young, which just means it's going to be a little fresher, which makes it a very easy drinking bourbon. And to me, it's great for desserts because it still has the sweetness from the corn, but a little bit of the charred oak barrel. So it tends to taste on our palate as more butterscotchy, more caramelly, more honey notes. Those will lend itself great for desserts. As the bourbon gets older, as you start going to a 5-year, a 7-year, a 10-year, you start to pick up heavier, deeper notes. The charcoal the charred wood is now seeping in. It's starting to really develop complexities of flavor. So to me, that's where we start to go with, don't worry, we're going to cook it. That's where we start to go with heavier applications like this. That's where this bourbon can stand up to something like soy sauce and Worcestershire garlic. It's got enough body. So this is an 8-year-old bourbon. I didn't use the bourbon just because I have bourbon contracts with people and have to be careful of brand. But when you have an 8-year bourbon, much, much deeper notes, heavier, more depth, more body. I don't have to. So the other thing with a younger bourbon, it's going to be a little bit thinner. So you may want to reduce it more to concentrate flavors. With this, I reduce it by 1/3 only to really burn out the alcohol, but the flavor's already in there. I don't have to burn off too much of it. So again, the older the bourbon, the less you have to reduce it. So you're not reducing it so much, but it's a more expensive bourbon, obviously, the older it is. So the money is about the same. To me, cost-wise, if you're buying a younger bourbon, you're reducing it more, so the cost goes there. If you're buying an older bourbon, it's more expensive, but you don't have to reduce it down as much. So you kind of save on one, whatever, but it basically pans out to about the same. So I have that. The other thing that's important, obviously, is the marinade. So I don't want the bourbon to be hot. And this is cooled down enough where I can put it in there. So that's my marinade. I just shake it around. It's a very simple a marinade. Like I can smell the bourbon in here. And so the other thing, if you notice, like I don't need a lot of marinade. It's actually a little bit goes a long way. So I'm going to throw that in there. Now what you do need is thyme. Thyme is a great, thyme not the herb, but thyme is in the passing of time. So I like to marinate these for a good 10 hours, 10 to 12 hours. It really gives you enough time to sort of get the flavors in there. And normally I would use a vac machine, but I don't have a vac machine at home. So we're going to kind of play by ear. But there's your pork marinade in a Ziploc bag. And I'm going to leave that in the fridge for 10 to 12 hours. Okay. Luckily, I did some last night. So I've got this ready for you. So these smell great. I'm going to pat these dry. And you can already see the color of the pork has become darker. It's picked up the marinade. It's ready to go. And I want to pat these dry. Remember, there's brown sugar. There's a lot of sweetness in it. The bourbon already has some sweetness in it. So whatever, if you can grill these, you can pan fry them, you can roast them. But whatever you do, you have to be careful because it will burn very quickly. So I'm going to start this guy up here. And I'm just going to pan fry today. But I don't want to wipe off too much of the marinade. But don't worry about it because the marinade now has penetrated, it's inside the meat. So don't worry too much about it. We want to pat it nice and dry. And while I'm getting that warmed up, I'm going to start my veggies. So what's interesting to me about bourbon is, we think about sort of the luxury bourbons that have become real popular. Sort of the Pappies of the world and the Stags of the world. And there's a point where, like, I generally will not cook with a bourbon that is over 10 years old. And it's not because the bourbon is not good, it's just there becomes a level of complexity that the bourbon has that you will lose when you cook it. Because anything that you cook, you're putting high heat onto it, and it's going to evaporate a lot of the liquid. So a lot of those, like, like a 12 or a 15-year-old bourbon is going to have some really beautiful, really elegant, very, very complex, subtle notes, and you will lose that in the cooking of it. So you can buy a bourbon that's $60 a bottle. I wouldn't cook with that. I think it's kind of a waste at that point. You want the flavor of bourbon. I think a 10-year-old bourbon gives you an incredible complexity, but also keeps it within cost. So you're not going to break the bank on that. So I'm going to chop up some shallots, some garlic. Let's see if this is hot. One more. And this sauce that I'm doing with it is a very popular sauce that we've had at my restaurant for a while. And they basically call it a bourbon grade mustard sauce. It's really just a reduction of bourbon, chicken stock, and we just fold in a nice high quality grain mustard right at the end. So now with the pork chops, I'm trying to find things that kind of, again, just sort of fortify the flavor. I'm going to go ahead and throw that in there. It really depends, like, what kind of. I got single. I don't know if you have a recipe, but I think the recipe has a double pork chop in there. But I haven't cut it into single bone-in pork chops because I really wanted more surface area for the marinade to penetrate. And I think these steaks are about 3/4 of an inch thick. And it's really nice because you're going to get flavor on both sides. Every bite is going to have flavor versus a really thick cut pork chop, which no matter how long you marinate it, it's never going to penetrate quite to the middle of it. Which means, though, the cooking time on this is going to be very fast. Which is perfect because of the sugar content, I don't want to leave it in the pan that long anyway. So I'm really just going to sear the outside. I'm going to give it like 1 more minute on that side while I get my mushrooms ready. I got some beautiful local shiitake mushrooms. And again, I love sort of when you have this idea of bourbon, soy sauce, umami. Like, this isn't really an Asian dish. I don't think of soy sauce as Asian. But I'm always looking for things that will sort of create that umami flavor. shiitake mushrooms have so much umami. They add so much flavor very quickly. Which I love that. And then finally, I'm going to do some Brussels sprouts because I love the way they crunch. But I'm not going to do the whole Brussels sprout, which will take forever to cook. I'm really just going to, so what I'm going to do is I'm taking out the core. And then I'm just going to separate out all the leaves. I'm just going to use some of the Brussels sprout leaves. So cut that. And then just sort of pour out the middle.
That looks great, and I didn't want to chime in because you're going to continue to do your demonstration, but also want to give a shout out to your wife Diane, who's an awesome videographer today.
No, she's done it before. She knows my cooking patterns. It's perfect. All right. And by the way, I don't know if people are allowed to talk, but if anyone has questions along the way, you're more than welcome to ask while I'm doing this stuff. All right, so here is let's see. I'm going to just give that a quick rinse. But I'm leaving this good stuff in the pan because I want that, all that brown stuff on the bottom is good. So we have some butter, some shallots, some garlic, some shallots. And we're going to just let that toast very nicely in the pan, very quickly. I don't want to get too much flavor. I don't want to get too much caramelization because what I'm doing is, you see, I'm going to start lifting all that good brown stuff from the bottom. And that's going to add a lot of flavor and color to what I'm doing. And very quickly, we're going to add some shiitake mushrooms. And then we're going to just let that kind of cook and wilt down. At this point, I could turn my heat down a little bit. Now, I'm going to check my pork. They're almost done. I'm going to let that rest a little, but I am going to pop it in the oven.
Yeah.
So let that stay warm. I don't want to cook it. It's really almost 90% cooked through. So I'm just going to let that warm in the oven. And then really we're just going to finish it with the sauce here. So we have bourbon, a little chicken stock, and a little heavy cream. And then a little really nice whole grain mustard. So good. Okay. And I'm just going to build the sauce right into this pan. So I'm not going to worry about. I'm going to throw just a little more butter in there, just a little salt. All right, bourbon time. Away from the flame. And the concept that I did before remains the same. So I add the bourbon first because I want to reduce it down a little, concentrate the flavor, but also evaporate the alcohol. The last thing you want, the worst thing in the world is to get a lovely steak or piece of pork with a sauce that is warm that doesn't have the alcohol burned up, because it will, the minute you try and eat it, it will go right up your nose and choke you. So it's really important to make sure the alcohol is burned up. And it's a very easy thing to do because alcohol will burn your nose. So all you do is like, right now, it chokes me. So all you have to do is waft some of this smoke or this steam that comes off. The minute you can breathe deeply and smell it without choking, the alcohol is burned off. It's not very scientific. But do you see how dark that beautiful, you're getting that beautiful gravy color in there? And I haven't done anything to it. It's really just the caramelization from the bottom of the pan and a little bit of reduced bourbon. And just, if you think about like the point of a sauce for pork or meat, you want something that feels complex, deep, rich. Like the bourbon has done all the work for you. I mean, they've aged this bourbon 8 years in pan. That's it. You don't have to do much more. You're really just kind of complementing it, but the bourbon has got such a deep, rich flavor. Like I could drink it just like that. It's so good. But I'm going to add some more stuff to it. So I've got about a cup of chicken stock. So once I can do this, right? I can smell it. I smell the bourbon. It feels good, but it doesn't burn my nose. I'm ready to add the chicken stock. So about a cup of chicken stock. And again, now I want to reduce the chicken stock. So I'm going to turn my heat back up to high and reduce that. At this point, I'm going to add my Brussels sprouts. So I want all that to kind of reduce together. Because I want to blanch the Brussels sprouts, but I don't want to kill them. I want them to have still a little bit of green and a little bit of crunch to it. Okay, now, while we're waiting for that, I'm going to find a fancy plate. We'll plate up right over here. Just going to do 2 to make it look pretty. Don't crowd your plate. Always have a spoon handy. Taste as you go. Very nice, very nice. Let that reduce just a little bit longer. As soon as it comes to a boil, you can basically add the rest of your ingredients. Grain mustard we always add at the end. Grain mustard has got vinegar in it. I learned this when I was cooking in France as a very young chef. You do not want to cook your mustard. So really the mustard, you kind of make sure everything's done. You season it, you flavor it, turn off the heat, whisk in your mustard, and that's the last thing. So you really do the mustard a la minute to retain its freshness, its brightness, its vibrancy. Or else it can get a little bit astringent, and it can actually fight with your sauce. So you don't want that. You want everyone to play nicely together. I'm going to add a little bit of heavy cream. And you see what I'm doing is I'm kind of adding everything a little bit at a time. So I add one liquid, let it reduce. Add the next liquid, let it reduce. The heavy cream is going to be the penultimate liquid that I add. And of course, as I just said, the final thing I'm going to add is my grainy mustard. At this point, I can go ahead and start seasoning with a little sea salt, a little bit of black pepper. I like a lot of black pepper because I'm just that kind of person. Really good. I get the mushrooms. It's like the mushrooms come up front. The bourbon is just coating my mouth. And the cream kind of just like helps to bridge everything together. And the one thing to me, because the pork is going to be very umami deep, there's a bourbon marinated in there. This is very bourbon heavy mushroom. To me, the mustard is just that one little bright element that cuts through everything, and it's just going to lift everything up. But again, bourbon, I call it a bourbon grain mustard sauce, not a mustard bourbon sauce. I mean, not a grain mustard bourbon sauce. So it's really important that bourbon is the lead flavor, not the mustard. So I'm only going to just add a little bit of mustard to it. If you add too much, it can really overpower everything. You see how the Brussels sprouts are cooked, fully cooked through, but they're still nice and vibrant green. They're not a muddy color, and I want to keep that. They're still going to have a little chew to it, a little bite. It's still going to taste fresh. Oh God, that's delicious. All right. So, and a lot of this we can taste and see. I'm really going to start with like a teaspoon. I'm just going to add that in there. Twist that around. I'm going to add one more. I think can handle just one more. Just another pinch of salt. That's perfect. All right. So, what I'll do first, take a slotted spoon. Get all my vegetables, mushrooms in there, nice garlic. Turn off the heat. And we'll follow it up with my sauce. And I really want to sauce the entire pork chop, get it all in there. So simple, you know, somewhat French, but not really French food. The bourbon makes it very Southern. If you want to go a little crazy, you could actually add bacon to that mushroom Brussels sprouts mix. I got a from my wife because she loves bacon. Who doesn't love bacon? But bacon and bourbon is like a really, really nice combination. But there you have it. Really simple. I made this super fast. It's so complex, but it's going to be really simple. I guess we can pretend like we're on a food show and we can do the whole tasting thing. Perfectly cooked, if I do say so myself. So perfectly cooked through, but still tender in the middle. I wish you could taste this. It's really good.
Taste it too. It looks awesome. That is so great.
Next year, hopefully, you guys get to come to Louisville, and we can share a meal together and drink together.
We're doing that. We will be there in April, just before we go to next year.
And you know what's important is so the other thing that's really important about this is like this is a lovely dish where like again bourbon you know in some circles bourbon is meant to like you shoot it and get drunk. But this is a lovely dish, and you can actually pair it with a really nice bourbon. And you can drink it on the rocks. You can make it into a cocktail like this, and an old fashioned is just spot on. So it turns bourbon into a much more of a complex culinary experience, versus something where you just sit up and get drunk. So I love it. I love that bourbon has all these identities, and you can really use it in so many versatile ways. So I can't join you for a shot later, but I'm going to do it right now. So thank you guys, everyone.
Thanks, Chef. That is awesome. That dish looks so good. I can't wait to try that when we come back in April.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, no, that was great. Really, really perfect, and great information about cooking with bourbon. And Marie, of course, your stuff earlier. It was kind of funny when you asked the question about Marie, about what people, the choice, and when you said gender. I'll have to give a shout out to one of our members, Farley Kaiser. Came out and said, "Oh no, that's not true. Like women drink bourbon too, especially in our group." And
especially in Kentucky.
Yeah. Bo will chime in on that in just a minute. Hey, Chef, before you go, I've got a question for you. Talk a little bit, if you can, about the community there, because I know that the restaurant and chef community is very tight with the, bourbon industry and the bourbon community.
It's funny. If you live in Louisville, if you live in Kentucky, bourbon is more of a lifestyle than it is a libation. Like we all have friends who work at a distillery. We all have friends who work for a bourbon company, either as a salesperson, a taster who works in the tasting room. We've all been to a wedding at a distillery. We've all been to party. Like we all know distillers. Like some of these people who are like rock star distillers, are people who are just every day in the community. So it's an interesting it's interesting to see it from inside Louisville, where bourbon I've seen it personally go from kind of slightly obscure cocktail to the hottest thing on the planet. But all of us, we truly do drink bourbon. Like that's what we do. We get together and we have a bourbon on the rocks. Maybe we drink wine and other things, but like it's such a part of ingrained in our lifestyle. And so as chefs, whenever we create menus, I don't know. I think it'd be different if you're in California with the wine industry, or Chicago or New York. Like we always create menu items where we know for sure that our customers are going to come in and also eat this with a bourbon. That we have many, many customers that do not drink wine and they will drink bourbon throughout their dinner. So we always keep that in the back of our mind, and we always create menu items based on that. And so there is this like symbiotic relationship, because a lot of the distillers will bring in their clients and customers that they're entertaining from all over the world into our restaurant. So we do feed off each other. And the more inspired we get with the food, the more they get with their bourbons. It kind of just like helps and builds each other. And I've been really excited to see what the bourbon world has done in terms of their distilleries, their new, like their small batch things, their promotional things that they do. It's really fun to see it on that ground level. And as chefs, we get excited by that, and we just want to jump on the train even more. So it really kind of works hand in hand. Listen, it's no coincidence that the food scene in Louisville has sort of risen up has coincided with the rise of bourbon as well. Like it's not a coincidence. Like the more popular bourbon, I mean, I can tell you personally, in my restaurants, every single weekend, half the dining room is filled with tourists. And I ask them, I go, what are you here for? And they all say the same thing. We're here to drink bourbon. So it's a really nice community we've built up. And unfortunately, we can't, we can drink bourbon. You can't come to my restaurant right now. But one of these days soon, we'll all get together and we'll all be back in a dining room, and we'll be drinking and hugging each other and doing shots at the end of the night. But yeah, I hope that we've built up such a wonderful community that I can't wait to get back to sort of creating that vibe.
That's awesome, Chef. Thank you so much. And you brought up a great question to turn it over to you, Bo. We know from the wine industry that they talk about that they drink like more gallons of beer while they're making wine. So to start off, before you get into the history of bourbon and what's going on in your world today, talk to us about that. And what do you guys drink? I know you're drinking bourbon all day. So what's your go-to when the shift is over or when you're done work for the day?
Yeah, that's a hard question, especially working here, because I'll usually have to follow up that question with my own question, which is, do I have, like in this world where I'm finding my favorite bourbon and drinking it, do I have to go find it and do I have to pay for it? Or can I just walk over to the lab and grab a bottle and drink it? Because those are two different answers. No. So personally, if I'm spending my own money, Buffalo Trace and Eagle Rare are my go-tos. So Eagle Rare 10-year-old barrel, $30 a bottle if you can find it. It doesn't really get much better than that as the deal goes. I used to drink, like if you asked me this question in 2011, I guess, like right when I started here, AAA, which is ancient age, it was 10-year-old ancient age, and Weller 12 would have been my two go-to answers. Now you don't see either one of those anywhere anymore. So
well, I don't know if that's your starting point into your talk, but that's one of the questions that's on my mind that I want to hear from you is, all the rarity that's going on now and, kind of when did it start and how has it really, how's it gotten to the point where it is now? I've got a question too, but why don't you start with us and talk a little bit about the history and then walk us through, your talk. And then I've got a few questions that Simon Majumdar has raised his hand. So I'll get that to you in a minute.
Yeah. So just one thing to give Edward more credit than he gave himself is, especially here in Louisville, their chefs were kind of the first adopters that got behind bourbon, and Edward being a big one. So like that video you showed, there are clips of Julian Van Winkle and Edward walking through Buffalo Trace, and kind of him backing Pappy Van Winkle and showing the superiority of bourbon to other spirits is really what started putting us on the map and got people to pay attention to us. You might say us, bourbon. And once people started paying attention to bourbon, it really kind of blew up from there. But yeah, I'll do a brief history of bourbon and how we got here. And I think to really look at bourbon, you have to look at Scotch as well. So to give you an idea on kind of the bourbon boom we're going through versus how much product is actually in market right now, globally, there is about 100 million case difference. So a case being 12 bottles of bourbon between bourbon and Scotch style whiskey. So all of bourbon put together is probably 15 to 20 million cases a year, where Scotch is 115 million cases. And that's because Great Britain colonized the world and took Scotch everywhere with them. So bourbon started really, 1700s is where bourbon kind of started compiling all this attributes and then being put into a bucket of this is bourbon. And so essentially you had bourbon growing, especially here in Kentucky, up until Prohibition. And then when Prohibition hit, so going into Prohibition, alcohol was the number one source of revenue for our country. And then in 1913, Uncle Sam put in the income tax and said, hey, we don't need this alcohol tax anymore because we got the income tax. We're going to do away with alcohol. So Prohibition hits. So when Prohibition hits, there was hundreds, maybe thousands of distilleries in Kentucky that were operating bourbon distilleries. 4 survived Prohibition. So we was now Buffalo Trace Distillery was lucky enough to be one of the ones that survived Prohibition. So essentially Prohibition knocked the industry on its butt, and then it started growing again after Prohibition in the 30s, and you get up to World War II, and essentially all the distilleries had to shut down and help out with the war efforts. So you could take a barrel of bourbon that is still aging and basically turn that into industrial alcohol to use for all sorts of various things. So all these distilleries, not just Buffalo Trace Distillery, you can talk to any of these distillers that have been around for a while, had to shut down to help out with the war efforts. Well then, so World War II ends in the 40s, and then in the early 50s, the Korean War starts gaining or growing, and all the distillers thought that the Korean War was going to be World War III. So then everybody overproduced. They started putting way more barrels away than we thought we would need because everyone assumed, hey, war is going to end, troops are going to come home, there's going to be insatiable thirst for whiskey, and we're not going to have enough. So let's overproduce. Well, so the industry overproduced. And this is I guess there's a silver lining to it. The main part was by the late 70s, the bottom fell out on bourbon because it was the overproduction from the 50s and 60s. What happens with a barrel of bourbon is you fill it today, and that first year you lose 10% of your volume. And each year you age it, the tax associated with that barrel is a fixed tax, about $250 per year per barrel to age in here in Kentucky. So the longer you age it, the less you get out of it, the more tax you're paying on it. So essentially, between the overproduction during the Korean War of bourbon and the rise of wine and vodka in the late 70s, early 80s, saw the bottom fall out on bourbon. So basically, someone came in and hit the reset button on bourbon in the 80s. And then ever since then, it's kind of been slowly picking up. So 1984, Elmer T. Lee, who worked at this distillery for 74 or 71 years, went into one of the old warehouses that he used to pick barrels out for Albert Blanton and take them to his house. And he would pick a barrel out, bottle it as a single barrel, and called it Blanton's Single Barrel Bourbon. That was the first time bourbon was commercially sold and bottled as a single barrel bourbon. And so, Edward said a complex culinary experience. So really, there is a complex tasting experience with bourbon. In America, forgot how to drink bourbon. It just turned into shooters and just rock gut whiskey that's getting dust on the bottom of the shelf. But I guess the silver lining to that whole, fallout with bourbon was that was really the first time bourbon had a chance to age up. Before that, bourbon was getting bottled younger, because after Prohibition, it was bottle it, make it as fast as you can, get it out the door. After World War II, troops were home, people were thirsty, bottle it fast as you can, get it out the door. So this was really the first time bourbon could age up. And so now in the 80s and 90s, there is some aged bourbon out there at a really good value that people started picking up on. So really, like through 90s, Japan, Europe kind of kept bourbon afloat. And so when we bought this distillery, Sazerac bought what is now Buffalo Trace Distillery. It was the Ancient Age Distillery, and it was actually owned by a Japanese company in the early 90s. We bought it and we kept some distribution overseas in place, but then took everything else up and have grown it domestically. So that kind of set the scene for the 2000s. And when the 2000s rolled around, I think just the trend in everything led really well to bourbon. So this craft revolution. So everyone wants to know what it is they're consuming, where it came from, what ingredients went in it. In most spirits, that's a really hard story to tell. With bourbon, it's very basics. It's here are the ingredients. It was corn, rye, malted barley. Here's a virgin oak barrel, and we added some water. And nothing else. You can't add anything else to be bourbon. So that lended itself really well with people, wanting superior products and wanting to know what's in them and know they don't have a bunch of weird chemicals that who knows how they're going to affect you. And so this is really in 2000s. I'm not sure when Edward started picking up bourbon. I think he was like early 2000s is when him and Julian started making kind of inroads. And so then the cocktails came on the scene. And between Mad Men, this cultural revolution, cocktails, people just started getting a taste for bourbon again. So now 2010 hits, and it's the demand boom is like we're right on the cusp of it. So I was hired here in 2011 to run our personalized barrel program. And that's where you can come in. It's actually the Eagle Rare sample in front of you where it says Specs Barrel Selection. So Specs, liquor store in Texas, came to the distillery, tasted through barrels of Eagle Rare, and handpicked that one. So I was brought in to run our barrel program in 2011 and have kind of been here to watch the bourbon boom go firsthand. But what really is kind of interesting, it's a demand boom more than anything. The bourbon is in the warehouse right now. So we're just now kind of getting caught up to where our sales forecasts are getting a little bit closer to the actual demand. So what's pretty interesting is kind of we've come full circle. When you get to 2020, what would have been a deal breaker for the bourbon industry in the past, this COVID shutdown, is the whole world shuts down. And so everyone's been asking, what's going on with bourbon? And it was kind of interesting. It was right, I would say March 16th was when they said no one's going to be at the distillery. Everyone's working remotely if you can, unless you're essential, yada, yada. And then I think within 7 days, we had retooled Buffalo Trace Distillery to produce hand sanitizer. And then Sazerac has distilleries all over the world. So we were actually equipped rather nicely to start running with hand sanitizer. So we have basically over this summer been able to use the scale that bourbon has got us to produce hand sanitizer for like Walmart, Amazon, a lot of these essential folks keeping it going. So it's kind of interesting to see this whole world collapse in front of us, but bourbon this time was like an oak tree, in a big storm. Whereas you see a lot of these, vodkas and gins that they don't really have the tourism and this massive support behind it. So now they're struggling for sales. But I think bourbon, there's such a gap with supply and demand that it's really not even being touched by this massive boom.
That's great. Hey, so I mentioned earlier Simon Majumdar, who's going to be with us actually in the November 11th session of this webinar. Who's a great friend of our association's. But he had a couple of questions. You know, he wanted to know, has bourbon become, kind of a catch-all phrase for all American whiskeys? And the follow-up to that was, he'd love to know about the symbiotic relationship between Scotch and bourbon, with the barrels, et cetera, that type of thing.
Yeah. So I think with bourbon, there's always going to be some labeling concerns, and it's, the TTB is tasked to manage what goes on every label, and they're far, outmatched, just the number of bottles that are hitting the market. So I would say you kind of want to be careful when you see something that says just bourbon. If you've never heard of it, the more there's Kentucky straight bourbon is bourbon that is made in Kentucky and aged for at least 3 years. There's, if you just see bourbon flavoring, you just got to be careful with labels. You can't really read too much into it. If you're really nervous, bottled and bond bourbon is a good way to kind of offset that concern, because bottled and bond bourbon has some constraints around it that make sure you're getting it from a good source. The symbiotic relationship with Scotch, it's a little, I don't really know if it's symbiotic. I mean, when you hear people in the bourbon industry talk about our competition, I know we are, and I know other, distilleries, we're looking at Scotch as the competition. The way we see it now is when the tide rises, all the boats in the harbor do too. There's a huge runway for growth with bourbon, and there's so much time before we're taking market share from Scotch is what we're after. But on the symbiotic relationship, I think he's referring to the used barrels. So what's unique with bourbon is the spirit that you can only use the barrel once. So imagine a barrel like a tea bag. If you use a tea bag once, you're going to get all that flavor, all that color from it. If you try to reuse that tea bag, you're not getting as much flavor or color from it. So bourbon's flavor, most of it is coming from that virgin oak barrel. Scotch, rum, tequila, all sorts of other products are using used bourbon barrels because there's not a constraint that says this product has to be aged in a new oak barrel like bourbon. So just economically, some Scotch producers, it just makes more sense to use used bourbon barrels. So yeah, I'm not sure if that was the answer we were looking for, but
yeah, no, that's cool. There's one other question too. This came from Andrea Gilman, who a lot of people here know, who used to work with us, and now she works with you and your organization, Sazerac. But she had a question about if you can, and then this is the end, we'll wrap this up and get to our bourbon tasting. So it'll be the last question. I'll put us all up here and see if Marie has something to end with us as well. But this quick question, if you could answer, she wanted to know about the bottle, or it said a lot of people may want to know about the bottle and bond and E.H. Taylor. And it's kind of interesting.
Yeah.
So I have one sitting right here.
Yeah. So this goes back to 1897. The Bottle and Bond Act was passed. So, Kevin, will you hold that bottle up and point to that tax stamp? So on the top, on the bottle, on the cork, there's a tax strip that goes atop the head of the bottle. So that is a bottle and bond tax stamp. And so in 1897, E.H. Taylor got the Bottle and Bond Act passed. And what that was the first Consumer Protection Act ever. So that was the first time consumers were protected against the products they're purchasing. And what that says is every drop of whiskey in that bottle came from the same distillery, was made by the same distiller in the same cooking season. It's at least 4 years old, and it's bottled at 100 proof. Because at that time, consumers didn't know what they were buying. So what this was a way to do is it was a way for the government to kind of put their mark of authority on it and say, yes, this is a authentic bottle and bond product. And that allowed the distillery to put that on it, but that allowed the governor to have kind of more insight into the tax side of things to make sure they're getting the tax on all these. So essentially, you can't use the bottle and bond unless you have, a distillery that you're making enough barrels to batch that together. They have to be 4 years old, So you're just getting kind of a superior product where you won't have to deal with some of those label issues. It's not to say bottled and bond bourbon is better than the other bourbon, but if you're just looking for a quick qualifier to say, hey, this is a decent one, that's a good way to look at it. So that Bottled and Bond Act 1897 led to the Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906. So that was kind of how it came about.
Great. Well, thanks. Marie, is there anything you want to close out with? And then I'm going to say, like, what we're doing next, we're going into the bourbon tasting. And it was a test that we did. So just the first time doing it, we sent out the first 20 people that registered for this, the first 20 members, were able to get a little kit. But we also did something where we gave away 5 cookbooks to people that, just as randomly drawn from people that registered. So the Smoke and Pickles cookbook from Edward Lee is going to Jennifer Rolander, Stacy Jo Thompson, Stan Dorsey, Lori Fulmer, and Steve Sturm. So thanks again to you guys. But what we're going to do here, Marie, if you can give us some closing comments, we're going to go to a short video that just shares some of the information about our sponsors, who this wouldn't be possible without all of our sponsors. So thank you to them. And while we do that, then we'll swap out the speakers coming in, and I'll tell you who it is. Todd Robinson, who is Amy Smith's husband. He is a wine and spirits consultant, so he's going to talk us through the tasting notes. And Andrea Gilman is going to join Bo to be here to talk as experts about their brands, because all of the brands that we're doing in the tasting are theirs. So Marie?
Besides the Shanks is not ours.
Oh, sorry about that.
Not Sazerac. The other 2 are Sazerac. They're all probably, good.
Marie?
Yeah, well, thank you, Kevin. I think as far as closing comments, I just want to thank you for the opportunity to be here today. And gosh, I think I know personally where I will be going to eat and going to drink bourbon next time I'm in Louisville. So thank you for the opportunity and the learnings.
Thanks for being with us. Really appreciate it. So yeah, here's a short video, 1-minute video, and we'll be right back. Sounds like a commercial, doesn't it?